So, Maven Repository Manager, the main problem we run into, the repository manager was primarily developed for us, trying to keep track of our central repository. That's where the primary impetus came from. Anybody who uses Maven probably uses a Vidéo, which is our central repository. And as we started including more open source artifacts and allowing other open source organizations to participate, we now have Apache, Codehouse, Object Web, Morphe, people who produce Jetty, JBoss wants to participate. And as a result, we've run into a lot of problems in trying to keep the integrity level of the repository. Nobody's trying to be malicious, but we often have problems, ironically, mostly from inside Apache. And we give people access to a directory and they can copy in what jars and palms and whatever they want to actually be synced up to the central repository. And we've had cases where official releases have been overwritten by people who have copied new files, which can be a disaster. The one probably worst example is someone overwriting the commons logging that had already been released, and somebody copied over another version which was actually binary incompatible. So trying to prevent problems like that. So some of the other reasons we want to try and create a manageable view of the repository. Right now, most people typically deploy a web-based repository, so they use Apache or Tomcat or Jetty to create a remote repository. So you're often resorting to looking around in directory structures to actually find things. So we actually want to try and create an easier view of the repository. We want people to be able to manage their repository. So for us, and this is often the case for people who are within an organization, we want to make sure that all the transitive closures for the dependencies are intact. We want to make sure the checkzones are intact. We want to make sure that released versions have been overwritten, and just maintain the basic quality level of the repository so we can actually do some other things. One place to see all the artifact information. Probably talk about it a bit later, but I'm not sure if anybody's ever seen CodeZoo by O'Reilly. They're trying to do something similar, or what we would like to do, but they're trying to manually keep track of everything, which is just not going to scale. And make it easy to maintain project metadata. So right now we have a very manual process of people finding problems in palms, whether they be hibernate, spring. Spring might actually get a little better because they announced at Spring 1 that they're going to start converting some of their peripheral builds to Maven, so their web services project and the rich client. And they're going to try that and then hopefully switch their core build over to Maven. So hopefully we won't have any problems this spring. But we want to create a small web app where people can actually submit corrections and we'll be able to easily apply them instead of right now we have one Maven developer who usually does most of the work, Carlos, who actually looks at all the changes, has to verify them, and it takes a lot of time to do. And we want to consolidate some existing open source projects. So there was Maven Proxy, which people used as a facade for within their organization. So inside your organization, you might use a proxy that all your developers point to. And behind that facade, you might use a Vidéo or JBoss's repository or any number of other repositories, including your own internal repositories. So we're trying to combine a tool called Proximity, even though they still seem to be making no releases, Maven Proxy, and there's a third tool, I can't remember the name of it, but we're trying to provide a focus for all these different proxying tools. There are also several searching tools. One of the authors of the Maven 1 book has a new little repository type searching tool called MVN Repository. Tim O'Brien. So we also want to combine all the searching tools as well. So right now, Maven Proxy is one of the tools that we actually didn't write, but we're supporting because a lot of people, it's the only tool you can actually use right now behind the firewall to manage all your repositories. So there are some alternatives. There's Jarhu, which used to be free, which is no longer free. Gauntlet, which is a tool that was written by Sam. I can't remember his name. He works for VA now. He's their CTO. But he made a tool to actually search repositories and manage them, and once this company was bought by EA, it sort of disappeared, so I'm not sure where that tool was gone. The Maven Registry, which is Tim O'Brien, the Maven 1 author, book author, along with Vincent. Ozak.com, which is out of date and focused on Maven 1 and has sort of been around for a long time. And Codezoo, which is O'Reilly's tool that they're trying to, they're actually collecting metadata in the same way that Maven does, except they have to do it in an entirely manual process. If anybody's seen java-source.net, that's sort of another place where they're trying to aggregate a lot of open source Java projects. So once the repository manager comes online, we're going to be able to index all the POMs we have for, there's around 4,000 different open source projects that have put their things in the repository. So we'll actually be able to categorize those and index those, so as people are making releases, you're going to have a lot more up-to-date information to actually find tools written in Java. The architecture is component-based. As with all the Maven tools, it uses Plexus, so it's easy to extend all the core functionality. One example where this was done recently, Continuum shares the same architecture as the repository manager, and the Geronimo developers have actually made a distributed version of Continuum that they use for testing the Geronimo TCK. So they have a cluster of 15 machines that they use to run the J2E TCK against Geronimo. And they created a new version of Continuum by re-implementing 4 of the components inside Continuum. So the repository manager is very much the same. We had no idea that the Geronimo people were doing it, so that is some indication that it's very possible to actually change the architecture to do whatever you want. And the repository manager will be the same. You'll also be able to extend the repository manager via plugins, which we'll talk about in a second. So there's a very simple outline of the architecture. So we have indexing and searching capabilities. We have the discoverer, which sort of stays online in a thread looking for new artifacts that have come in, and it feeds those artifacts into the indexer and the reporter and the converter. So the reporter we have an API for creating reports. It's very similar to the API we have for Maven reports. So the basic reports we have right now, this is actually in Apache SVN right now. It's actually fully functional. The web UI is not complete yet, but it's actually working. So we have simple reports for reporting on the integrity of the repository, dependency closures. The converter, which we're using to translate Maven 1 repositories and Maven 1 POMs and Maven 1 projects over to Maven 2. So we usually do this on a daily basis. Anybody who's using Maven 1 right now is actually using the Maven 2 repository, and we use a set of Apache rewrite rules to actually translate Maven 1 requests into Maven 2. So we're actively using this converter every day. Everything that comes in as a Maven 1 submission is converted over to Maven 2, and that's what's used. And the proxy, as we talked about, is the Maven proxy capability. So again, some of the reports: repository integrity, dependency analysis. So we would actually like to be able to make visual graphs of small sets of projects. But one of the things we'd also like to do is try and create an entire graph of all the open source projects that we can get a hold of. So this is one of the experimental things I'm trying to do with all the repository data. So once we have a complete entire graph, we can feed it into other applications or use that graph with things like Continuum. So the distributed version of Continuum that the Geronimo people have been working on, we would actually like to try and apply to every open source project we can get hold of, and sort of use the visualization of this graph to do things like light up a little red node on a graph so you can actually see within an ecology of all the open source projects what's not working. So these are some of the experimental things I'm working on. If anybody's on the Maven user list, does anybody know Brett Porter? Yeah. I usually I do the prototypes, and then Brett actually does the work of finishing it. Maven plugins and archetypes and Plexus components. right now we have, because Maven 2 doesn't actually ship with any plugins, everything is transparently downloaded on the fly. And the same with Maven archetypes if anybody uses them, and as well as all the underlying Plexus components. So what we want to be able to do with the repository manager is to be able to scan the entire repository, find all the Maven plugins, archetypes, Plexus components, and to be able to produce a report so people can actually find all the plugins by category. If you want to find all the testing plugins, if you want to find all the source generation plugins like Antler, or Java CC, or Stable CC, we'll be able to produce reports to find them. Because right now we're trying to track those things manually. It's virtually impossible because you can set up your own repository and people can use plugins from anywhere. Even if they've submitted them to the central repository, we don't really have any real way of tracking all those plugins. So there's quite a bit of functionality available which we're not actually able to share with the rest of the Maven community because we don't know it's there. And this again is something that you'll be able to use within your organization if you have particular types of artifacts. One of the first people extending this is the Geronimo developers who are making their own plugins. So they deploy their own type of plugin with their own metadata to a Maven repository, and they will be able to make a report to actually generate a list of all the Geronimo plugins, so the Geronimo users will actually be able to see what plugins are available. The proxying, as we talked about, a facade for many back-end repositories. We have one client that we're working with where you can actually make custom setups. So you may have old legacy repositories if you're using different build systems. You can actually proxy a repository layout that's entirely different than the Maven 2. Maven 2's artifact system actually has a way of abstracting the layout of a repository. But you might want to pull artifacts from a database or an SCM repository that's different than the way Maven does it with Wagon, the underlying transport mechanism. And you can also do things like we have one client that wants to build with Maven, but we actually produce RPMs for them. So we're doing their C build for them, and we produce RPMs from their developers. But their systems engineering people still are not the type that would probably use Maven. We're actually trying to work on that. But they're used to using tools like UpToDate and Yum. So we actually make a Maven repository look like a Yum repository, so that developers can work on deploying, use Maven to build RPMs and deploy them to a repository. But their system administrators and operations people can use tools like Yum to actually pull down from a Maven repository, but actually have it look like a Yum repository. Synchronization. So right now we actually pull in from many other repositories like Apache and Object Web. And you might do this yourself, like depending on how your organization is set up to your particular department. You may be pulling in from external repositories dependencies. You may be wanting to sync internal repositories. We're currently breaking up. We have snapshot repositories and release repositories, and for some tests we actually sync those together. So you can actually sync external or internal repositories, and it works with, I've already said that, being able to talk to many external repositories. Plugins. So again, it's easy to override the key components using Plexus to actually change the infrastructure if you need to. It uses the same plugin mechanism that is in Maven. Plexus has a built-in framework for creating plugin mechanisms. So Maven uses it. Continuum 1.1 is going to use it, and the repository manager and every other subsequent Maven application use the same plugin infrastructure. So possible features that might come out in the end. Some access control and workflow. So you may have different repositories for your development environment, testing environment, QA environment, or production. And we're thinking about trying to add workflows between those things and access control so that someone can approve a set of artifacts that have been created for testing if you want to push up to QA, and moving artifacts around a set of repositories using a workflow. A channels approach, as I talked about with Yum, so you actually might want to create channels for the repository, release descriptor from the prepare stage of the release. So the Maven plugin will prepare a release and actually create a descriptor for you and send it to Continuum. So Continuum would then have a release descriptor and someone could approve that release, and that release would tie in via a web service to the repository manager to actually deploy it in the right place. So these are how we're trying to hook up these applications, and that's one of the possible features that the repository manager will do. It's a feature that's being worked on in Continuum, and it's something we might be able to link up with a web service later on. Advanced search capabilities. Right now you can search via a limited set of elements in the POM, and it's first pass. It's very simple. So something we'd like to do in the future is try and extend it so that we can provide general access for indexing any portion of the POM. Continuum integration via web services is a release example. We'd like to have RSS notifications, so every time a release is detected. So part of doing a release, the new way that we would like to do a release and producing a descriptor, that metadata would also be deployed to the repository. So if open source projects were creating releases and this descriptor was available, it's something that would get sent to the central repository. One of our plugin mechanisms would search and actually find a release, and we could create RSS notifications. For this first example, we would probably only do official releases. So you would pretty much know instantaneously when a new release had hit. It would probably, the RSS feed would probably come out in the centralized repository manager before the announcements were made on mailing lists. And custom user dashboards. These are things we're trying to work on all the applications, but right now for the first version of the web UI of the repository manager, it's a fairly standard view, but it's something we'd like to be able to customize, like Jira has a custom dashboard for. You may only be interested in releases, or you may only be interested in the integrity of the repository if you're a system administrator. So those are some of the features that we might like to have in the future. We're trying to make the first release for OSCON, which is the end of July.